Hey everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of my character creation illustration course right here on YouTube, using the OOF character from my IP, Dog Days Volume 1. In the previous session, we would have worked together and talked about using organic lines, organic shapes, organic forms to kind of help construct the character design, help us figure out placement of features, help us to figure out the reason and rhyme behind the overall design. And thus, once we think that process through, we set the stage essentially. We set up the entire design production process and ready it for the coloring phase of things, the coloring stages of things. And in my pipeline process, in my production process, this is called, I like to refer to this as priming my flats, the priming flats. And the reason why I call it the priming flats is because the colors that we essentially will be using in the design at first, they're not the final iterations of the colors, it's not the finished colors, they're just the base layer, just that first coat that helps us to understand what we need to build on top of. Okay, it also helps us to kind of understand what kind of tone we're setting in terms of the color, just the overall mood, the overall theme that we're working with, making sure that it fits into that theme and the environment. And at that stage, it also allows us to kind of make any adjustments or making any fixes that we need to early on before we progress into the finer details, the more refined side of the actual output, final output. All right. So what I like to do in the priming flats firstly is to select a color, my first colors, that kind of flesh tone, a salmon color, that helps me to fill the entire design, the entire line art, and essentially create a silhouette. This silhouette is meant to help me do a couple of things. Not only am I defining where the boundary lines, where the start and end point of my design, of my creature design might be, where those points exist, but I'm also allowing myself to, in Photoshop, clip any of the works that I do, any additional features. I can clip any additional features that I create for the design to that first prime layer. So if anything that I want to do to affect only OOF as a fish, I will use that first flat color. In this case, it's the kind of reddish tone, that salmon flesh tone. You can use a different color, and just something to note, depending on the colors that you use or the color that you might use, because you can use one color and just use a range in that particular range, that family of values. Just use those values to fill out your scene and just create depth. You can use darker tones to create more shadowy areas, more areas that are further away, and in case of a character design, features that are more inset, you can use darker colors. Areas that have light, you have lighter colors, lighter tones, or illuminated colors on those areas, the high points of the nose, the eyeballs, areas that reflect light. But depending on the color that you use, it is going to help inform the temperature of the overall design, the overall finished piece. Because if you use warmer colors at your base level and you build on top of that, using that as your point of reference for informing what you do in the production of your character design of your piece, then of course everything is going to take on a warmer finish. If you use cooler colors, so the blues, the more muted colors, then you're going to get a colder, cooler finish. All right, so you can try that out depending on the demands of the particular project. If you're working on a private piece, then for sure try to experiment. But if you're working on something on a commercial level and you know that there are certain descriptors used to tell you about the character design, and one of the things might be the character exists in water, you know that definitely there are some colors that do automatically come to mind. Now in this case, I might have used a flesh tone. But in your case, you might want to use a flat blue, a flat green, a turquoise, aquamarine, something that fits the environment of an underwater marine environment. Okay? So once you've used your flat color, you've filled the entire design. There are several ways of approaching this. I like to do it by hand because I get to be more up close and personal. I get a more intimate kind of experience with filling out the design and choosing what the areas that I actually want to use in my final process. Once the entire design is completely filled out with your flat color, the idea here is to use that entire silhouette as your blueprint for anything or the majority of what you may create, any feature that you might build on top for that character design. All right. Now, depending on the environment that you are placing the character in, the lighting would be different. It would be suited. It will have to be customized and set up to match the environment that you've created. In this particular instance, as I mentioned, Oof is going to be placed or be positioned in an ocean setting. So I've already kind of figured out where the light is going to be coming from, just how much of his body is going to be exposed out of the water, how much is going to be seen under the water, and maybe even the time of day. I kind of already have that in my head. And how do I know that? Well, I chose the warmer side of colors. I chose colors from the warmer side of the table to kind of start building out and fleshing out my scene. Yes, there's a combination of the reds and the blues and whatnot on top of that, or in conjunction with that. But at a very base core level, my flat color or my flat colors remain very consistent with the theme and or the environment. Even the style has to be taken into consideration, the overall art style. But generally speaking, when it comes to having a process for building up the details from the line art all the way up to the final polished level, using these flat colors that more or less create a color by number system for you is one of the better ways to go. So you place your characters in one particular flat color, and again, if you're staying in the family of colors, you just shift the value. Okay, so you go either lighter or darker depending on how you're building the scene out. In this particular instance, here, Oof is one object or one asset inside of the entire environment. We have him as the one subject, and then we have the foreground, midground, background. We use one flat color to identify him, and then other flat colors that relate to the particular environment respectively. So for the sky, we would have used a flat blue. For the water, we would have used a gradient or a kind of palish blue, powder blue. And then for the water, we end up with something a lot darker, something that gives us a little more depth and allows us to paint on top of that and give us some more features that clearly identifies the blue surface area as water and the sky as the sky. And then of course we have Oof as the subject matter, clearly identified by the flat colors that we would have used as our priming flats. Now once you've put your flat colors down, once you've actually created a sort of a layout, a plan, a map, a roadmap for your colors, the next step is to start making sure that those colors can gel together, that they blend, and not necessarily in the sense of bleeding one into the other, but definitely meaning that the tones, the way that the light would interact with the respective colors, the way that the shadows will appear, and with the way that values will have to be used to create and flesh out the rest of the scene, definitely takes precedence here. So I would use things like my smudge tool or just a blending brush to blend the areas, at least in the water, where I would have had the surface level start off at a lighter color and make its way down into the depths at a darker color, so therefore creating a gradient. Now of course you could just more or less select the area with a lasso tool and pull a gradient. That's definitely an option, but once again, to reiterate, I like the idea of going in by hand and naturally, organically kind of painting in the areas that might have a little more intense areas of light, and then as it fades, I could actually control what areas might appear darker, so the shadows at the depths of the water appear more intense and a little more opaque. Now, what I've decided to do, even though this part of we're not at that point in the process for us to explore this fully, but what I like to do when I began putting down my priming flats is start also using some flat colors like my whites or maybe some other very a lighter version of a color to establish where my hot points on a particular piece or in a particular area, surface area might be. So in this case, because the waves will be rolling, they're undulating, there are certain areas that the light will be hitting the most. And so those areas, which will be the lines that you're seeing me kind of paint in on the rim on certain areas, would be the points that will show up the sharpest or the hardest. That's where the glows will be the brightest. All right, those hot points you would typically see on someone's face. Even right now, if you were to look at the tip of my nose, that little shiny area there, yeah, that's a hot point. So that's what we're doing in terms of on the surface of the water. That's what's also going to contribute towards the later stage where we paint the refraction of the light on the water and have caustics appearing on the bottom of Oof's form and shape. So spending some time really thinking about your scene, how you're going to apply your flats, your priming flats, why you are using certain colors, ensuring that it aligns with the overall theme, the overall tone, the overall mood, just ensure that the colors, while they don't have to be complementary by design, they don't have to be complementary in nature, they do need to make sense in communicating the story. What we're going to see next, once we've put our priming flats down, we've kind of established where light is going to be coming from. We know what areas are designated for what. We have our sky area completely mapped out, we have our water mapped out, and we have our subject, which is Oof. We can now move into creating or applying colors that are specific to the design. So the colors that we intend to use for the overall finished product. In this case, we're going to start off for using green, or kind of a base green for Oof, and work from there, building out a lot of the details in the colors. So there may be even gradations and variations in color on the actual surface of the skin, but then also the features of the character design. So the flat green comes in, and we can definitely see that it works already, it looks good, but it's not finished because we have lighting in the environment. We see some clouds in the background. We have the hot points kind of more or less giving an outline to how the waves are undulating and giving some motion. We have some bubbles appearing under Oof around him, also providing some sense of motion. And so just using those couple simple features, those details in the design already begins to sell the overall product, the overall finished product. However, we definitely would need to start working with actual lighting and shadows in the coloring phase of things, because the flats are just that. It's flat. It's just meant to be like the table or the kickboard that the other design elements are meant to build on top of. And the color part of the color phase of things, the coloring side of things, is definitely a big one. So one of the things I like to do once my colors are locked in is, in order to create more shadowed areas in the features, I go in, or just to kind of give a little more form, a three-dimensionality to certain parts of the form, I will sample the color, the flat color that I might use. In this case, it's green. Sample it, adjust it slightly inside of the color picker, and then I will have that layer, a new layer set to multiply, where I would go in and start painting in some shadows into the features. So while the flats are down, while the flats are being placed in, so we're using colors in the same along the same spectrum and kind of filling in the details, because we're not getting too crazy with additional finer details like hair or scales or cracks or anything like that. We're just kind of establishing how light is beginning to affect the features of the design where the color is concerned. We saw that in the organic line phase of things, how lighting might affect the actual design. What this is meant to do is meant to show you how the light is affecting the form and what features will need more emphasis, might need more more time, more attention. It definitely would show you just how the character is moving, how it's being positioned, how the form is being pulled in and pulled out of the page, rather out of the screen. And at that stage, then you know, okay, certain areas are hidden, certain areas are exposed, and you know just how much detail, how much attention, how much time, how much light that you have to kind of paint in order to sell the effect even more, to sell the piece even more. So once I start recognizing, okay, the light in this particular instance for Oof is coming from the top right hand side, or our top right hand side, his top left, a little bit to the back of him, but it's definitely shining down. It's going to be casting some shadows, but absolutely highlighting a lot of the details at the top of his head, his eyes, his eyeballs, the scales of his skin. Anything that's above the surface of the water is going to have to be very detailed. We're going to get away with some of it in the under or the subsurface of the design. Just anything that goes below his face underwater, you can get away with that because there's a lot of blurring and blending happening in terms of the light, unless of course it's a crystal clear aquatic scene you're building. You typically, when we're dealing with ocean scenes, there's that haziness, that blurriness, that kind of allows you to get away with silhouettes and shadows and stuff like that. So there's a lot more time that has to be spent on the top half of the, or top portion of the design, where light is exposing a lot of the details. And with that comes not only the amount of colors that you use and the amount of light that you paint, but how your shadows definitely responds to that light. Paying attention to how light behaves by using reference. Yes, you can use videos and pictures, but going outside and understanding how light will behave at certain points in the day, at different settings, and even looking at how artificial light, looking at 3-point lights, 4-point lights, lights with a multi-light setup, looking at stage lights and how they behave, looking at studio lights and how they behave, looking at ring lights and how they behave. Understanding how lighting as a whole might affect different subject matter absolutely contributes towards you as an artist having a far greater library of knowledge and information that you could pull on when painting light, colors, and shadows. Because this is essentially us, or you as an artist, rendering the image by hand, having that information in your mind, and then using that relationship, that synchronized relationship, like I said in part 1, and really produce something that looks as close to real as possible. You may not be going for hyperrealism, but understanding how the physics and how these properties behave under the context of real world physics definitely gives you a guideline, a playbook to work with when translating that information into a stylized, more artistic, creative environment. All right, or format or platform. As I mentioned in part 1 and in many of my other videos, once I'm creating any character designs, environments, prototypes, any conceptual art, light will always be king. Light is responsible for everything that we see and we cannot see. All right, without light, rather, we won't see a lot. So with light, we do have to pay attention. With light, we have to pay attention to several things, several moving cogs at the same time, several pieces of mechanics happening at the same time, and appreciating the fact that you have to spend time with light in order for anything to look good is really going to put you ahead of the game where your designs are concerned. If you rush ahead and try to add details onto color, lots of patterns and maybe really detailed line art, that will look good and will only go so far. But the moment you step into lighting territory, or you're talking about lights, colors, and shadows, you're talking about creating form or pulling form out of a character design, you're absolutely going to have to pay attention to learning how to paint shadows and work with subtlety. It's not always about creating these harsh comic book style shadows, because I also see that sometimes in character designs innocently, where someone or artist may create characters and unintentionally create shadows that are so hard that it could tend to really destroy or muddy a lot of the potential the design might have. And that could be on purpose. Maybe it might be a time constraint thing. We all have our workarounds to kind of circumvent our design hiccups. But once you're working with things at least up close like this, or where you definitely want to create a caliber of work that is much higher than the standard stuff that you might see out there, you're going to have to spend time with the subject matters, the subject areas that even the greats spend time with. They spend time understanding. So all the Da Vinci's and the Raphaels and the Van Goghs and the Picassos, they spend time understanding certain principles and understanding how to then go beyond those boundaries, to break the rules basically, or bend the rules to fit their needs or their storytelling through their art. And character design is essentially storytelling in art. Art is storytelling. All right, it's just that we have a lot more room, a lot more flexibility, way more options in how we express those stories beyond just alphanumeric means, beyond just letters and words and numbers. All right, we have colors and light and form and lines and shadows and depth and effects. We have so much that we can do to express these ideas that we have to firstly understand the concepts as it applies to us in the real world, and then be able to translate that into the digital world as you're creating your characters. Pen or paper, graphic tablet, or 3D software, doesn't matter. The principles still apply across any discipline in the creative field where visual creation is concerned. Moving or static subjects, that is. Now, using your shadows to help define areas is a very important and almost neat, is a very important process to keep in mind. Painting your shadows in such a way to help inform the actual features or the details of your character design. Sometimes you can focus so much on the line art telling us what features are needed or what features would be present in the final design, when by the time we do away with some of the line art, those construction lines, and actually go with what the lighting tells us, we come to understand that the lights and shadows is where the real magic happens. If you can play with lights and shadows and imply or infer certain things in your design, it works. As you can see in the tail down below, just under oof, there's not a lot of detail going on there. Yes, you're seeing lots of lines pulled, there's lots of the streaks happening. However, because this is subsurface, there's a lot of smudging and blurring going on, and the shadows, they're just meant to provide some layers, some depth to the actual tail design. The tail itself in and of itself as a body, as one particular an attachment to oof, does not look very impressive, nor does it contain a lot of details. All right, what we are seeing, however, is that by using shadows, simply by sampling the colors of the environment, so that might be an off-gray blue, a muted aquamarine color, that gradient that we would have initially set up in our priming flats, and I sampled any part of that particular ramp, I'm able then to paint in certain details in the tail area and have it still blend coherently, cohesively with the information found in the environment, in the overall design. And I take that principle and apply it to the entire character, where as long as harsh light is not affecting that portion of the character, it just means that potentially deeper, darker shadows are taking control, that they do have a stronger foothold in the design, because the light and shadows, they occur at the same time. They can't exist one without the other. All right, as long as there's light, there's going to be shadow somewhere, and if there is a shadow, it just means that light is in fact coming from somewhere. So paying attention to how things like not only how ambient light might work, or how direct light might work, sunlight might work, we're looking at how the effects of the light on the character design behave. So in some cases, like the eyeball, we will see that rim lighting or edge lighting on the character would look very different to rim lighting or reflective lighting, specular lighting inside of the eyeball. There's several components that we have to pay attention to in the eyeball in and of itself when painting reflections, as opposed to rim light that is just meant to act almost like a halo or a silhouette that runs around the general outline of the character as the sun is hitting it, because that's more or less like a backlight, a harsh backlight hitting the character, and you see it sometimes in film. We're going to have to represent that by painting in some harsh outlines of light around the edges and the details, and sometimes even if there's hair present, you have some stray hairs that you might make highlighted, just to show that there is a level of penetration happening around the edges of the character where the light is shining through. So it's giving you the outline, but it's also kind of showing you that it's it's blurring it, or it's blowing it out hard enough, or it's kind of obscuring it enough because of the brightness, the temperature. It's just so hot. That area is just like a hot point on the very edge, and that sells the image also, because if you look at the inverse of that just below, the lines of the shadows are also extremely dark. So on the edge at the top, you have the very bright lines, which is the light. That's the rim light, that's the edge light, that's the reflections. All right, and at the bottom, we have what in the 3D world that we have ambient occlusion going on in the actual fin itself, and even in the cracks and the crevices of the scales, and on the skin, on the tendrils, the teeth, and even the folds of the eyes. We have shadows doing all of this. This is not line art or line work necessarily. Yes, you're pulling lines, but this is not done in the line art stage, because you can't actually know that until you get to the color phase, or when you begin painting in the lights and the shadows. So spending some time with your lights and your shadows once you've applied your priming flats really is going to give you the most polished results that you possibly can find, because you can have a finished piece, extremely flat colors, lovely details, and you can still do some color correction and end up with wonderful results. But obviously, based on the demands of the project, based on the design that you're going for, the overall output, I can almost guarantee that if you spend some time with your lights and shadows and make them work together for the sake of achieving the greatest range out of the colors that you might use on one for your character design, and then layer details on top of that, if that does not assist in producing a higher quality of work, then by all means, please feel free to let me know, that I may be a little mistaken in the process. But based on what I've seen in a lot of my works, this allowed me to, in a step-by-step, and ensuring that I use my layers inside of Photoshop. So using my Photoshop layers, and when I'm doing this, ensures that if in the event I have to go back and either drop the opacity of something, turn something off, alter it completely, I can't do that. I'm not painting everything on one layer. So just to recap, using my layers, painting shadows, painting my lights, and then doing all of this on top of the flats that I would have started off with, I would have included planning time for why I would have used certain colors in certain areas, and then what's my approach in terms of my lights and shadows where my lighting direction is concerned. So ensuring that you have a sense of where your lighting is going to be coming from is a huge part in lighting your scene, coloring your character, coloring your environment, and bringing it to that final polished place, that final rendering. So in the next part, what I will be doing is detailing OOF a lot more, going in using lights, shadows, some more colors, and painting additional features for OOF before we move on to the Lightroom stage in post-processing, where we begin to sharpen, soften certain features, mask certain areas, and really bring out what we see as the final process. In the next part, we're going to fill out the environment a lot more. We're going to ensure that all of the colors that we have in our scene and all of the details do pull together and bind together nicely, that they communicate with one another smoothly, and that the final product is going to just going to be the results of a very meticulous step-by-step process that we can go back, look at the layers, dissect it, and discuss how we arrived at that particular end goal. So until the next video, I just want to thank you for taking the time to follow along up to this point, for taking your line art and applying some color to it, applying some light, some shadows, thinking about your environment, and even thinking ahead as to how these finer details are all going to pull together. So until the next video, I just want to thank you for remaining consistent, for remaining focused, and I would just like to also add to remember to follow the compass. So until the next one, where we continue with the details, this is Kyle Stephen for the Digital Compass and the Digital Academy, signing out until the next one. Have a great one, guys. See ya.